our whole way of life here in the West is under threat by this, what my mom used to call this army of shadow that she warned about, 20 years ago. It comes and goes in waves, right? As their population grows, they're able to impose more and more of their beliefs and their system of laws. Their goal is to live under Sharia law. There was a complete erosion of our Western, ideals and values in our Christianity within Europe that's been happening over the last, 30, 40, 50 years. That has also participated in allowing, Islam to come into our countries over here. It's all linked, at the end of the day.
The vacuum had to be created for that to fill it, right?
Exactly. That's the word that I was looking for, the vacuum. Yeah.
This is Paul Joseph Watson with Summit.News in a new interview series we're calling Newsmakers, featuring, as the title suggests, newsmakers. And we're talking today to Noor Bin Ladin. The website is noorbinladin.com. That's going to be in the description below. The niece of 9/11 terror mastermind Osama bin Laden, and a person in her own right, of course. Noor, welcome.
Thanks, Paul. Nice to see you.
Now, I saw you a few days ago on Tucker Carlson. This is going to be a somewhat different interview to that, because we're going to go into long-form conversation style. But that must have been pretty nerve-wracking. That was your first ever live interview, as far as I understand, right?
You're absolutely correct. It was the first, but it was wonderful to be invited and to be able to share a few of my thoughts on this platform. I personally follow Tucker Carlson's show every day. It's one of my main sources of the news, considering he's one of the very few people, in the mainstream media, who actually reports the news. Yeah. So.
Now, I want to get into how you burst onto the scene, because kind of all started last month. Of course, you'd been planning this for a while. We'd spoken about it many, many months before that. And that was the New York Post article released back at the start of last month. Osama bin Laden's niece says only Trump can prevent another 9/11. Now, we're going to get into your family history. Of course, your mother wrote the best-selling book. Going to get into the history of her experiences in Saudi Arabia and your experiences of the family itself. But before we delve into that, I suppose the first question is, given all that's happening, given the timing of this, why did you decide to go public, and why now?
Well, as you mentioned, and maybe we can do a little disclaimer to your audience, but we've been mates, for a couple of years now, and we've talked about my views, and we share a lot of similar views, you and I, and it was the right time in the sense that there were a few things that needed to work out, but I found, John from the New York Post, I felt really comfortable going public with John as the person who was going to interview me, and the New York Post itself. I mean, I have a lot of respect for this publication. So things just, worked out in a very organic way for it to happen at that moment specifically, compared to maybe, say, a few months before. And the reason why I absolutely wanted to go public at that moment was because of the upcoming elections. And, I'm quite of a private person, but I felt very, very strongly in coming out in support of President Trump ahead of November 3rd.
Because you were umming and ahhing about this for many months. Not only when you would come out, but also the style, the platform you would go for, how you would expose your story to the public, and what message you wanted to bring to the public. How did you anticipate beforehand what the reaction would be, and what kind of response did you get, positive or negative? Because When it came out, I remember back at the start of September, this went completely viral. You were trending on Twitter immediately. Did you expect such an immediate response? And what has the response been? What has the backlash been in terms of positive and negative responses, reactions to what you had to say in this New York Post article?
I anticipated it in the sense that I knew that because of my name, I had an immediate platform. And this is why I felt very much a sense of responsibility and a sense of duty to speak up. And on a very personal level, I knew deep inside my heart that if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to look at myself in the mirror knowing that I had this platform simply because of the name that I carry, and I hadn't used it to speak up about my beliefs. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. Not surprisingly so, because it echoes my personal experience in a more private capacity in terms of carrying this name and the response of the American people. As you mentioned briefly, and we'll get to talk about that, but the reactions to my mom's story and when she released her book, and it was a New York Times bestseller, and she did a lot of media back in the day, and the reception of the American public to our story, namely that my mother, my two sisters, and I have, yes, we carry that name, but we have nothing to do with these values. The response was so heartwarming to me as a teenager, carrying that name. And I always say this, but it's true. The reaction of the American people definitely helped me navigate and cope with carrying a name that is so antithetical to everything that I stand for. And, we would be walking in the street in the US, and people would come up to my mom and, hug her and say how brave she was for speaking out. And this is what I saw. And it's a testament to the American people, who are the most open-minded, kind-hearted, and as I said, on Twitter, least racist people on the planet. And that's, the narrative that they're drumming nonstop, in the media and academia and everything about America and Americans being, the society being racist, is complete garbage and not at all the case. And I've lived it personally. And my coming out and the reaction I received was further proof of that.
Now, the question many people will be asking, and you kind of addressed this a couple of weeks ago when you said basically you'd received more heat for your support for President Trump than for your surname. Of course, the question on everybody's lips is, given the ominous nature of this surname and everything it entails, given that obviously you're at complete odds with everything that your uncle Osama bin Laden stood for, why, Noor, did you never, I mean, you must have considered it, but why did you finally make the decision not to change your surname?
So this question, I have a top 5 or so of questions I get asked the most often, also in my private life. And this is definitely one of, the most recurring ones. When 9/11 happened, I was 14 years old. And so my mother took the decision. I wasn't, yet of age, but I'm so, I completely agree with her reasoning then. And it's something that I decided to uphold myself, but we didn't want to lie. We didn't want to lie about who we are, and we rather choose to explain our position, the fact that the 4 of us, have nothing to do with this ideology and these values. And it's also a question of, out of respect of the families, of the victims and all those who suffered on that tragic day. We didn't want, I feel, these people are owed the truth, and they have a right to know with whom they're speaking, and we didn't want to hide that to them.
I'm going to get into the book and your mother's history in Saudi Arabia, but I guess the number 2 question, and I think we've talked about this before briefly in person, and I don't know how much you want to get into, but obviously, if your mother had had any serious hard intel about 9/11 beforehand, she would have passed it on to the authorities. Of course, you were
Of
very young
course.
at the time. But looking back in hindsight, immediately before 9/11, in the days, in the weeks, months beforehand, had you heard anything odd from within the family, or did you notice anything somewhat strange or different from the behavior of the family, which, of course, you were separated from at this point? I'm talking about Osama bin Laden in particular. But did you hear anything or get any inclination before 9/11, looking back in hindsight, that something big was potentially about to take place?
Well, at that moment in time, we were completely cut off from the rest of the family.
Mm,
And it had been many years that had been the case because of my parents' really acrimonious divorce and my father's, complete rejection of the way my mother raised both my older sisters and myself, with Western values. There had been, I want to say at least 5 years, 4 or 5 years prior to 9/11, a complete cutoff of communications. So in that sense, absolutely not. My mother, however, having analyzed the Saudi society from a very unique vantage point when she was living there, when my parents were still together, having analyzed the mentality and also all the events that unfolded, throughout the 90s with, you know, Osama bin Laden's previous terror attacks, whether it was, in 1993 in the basement of the World Trade Center or the 1998 bombings, in Tanzania and in Kenya. There had been, a string of events that you could follow the thread through. And so while my mother knew that Osama bin Laden wasn't going to stop,
mm.
um, his vendetta against the West, she obviously could never have imagined that it would be something on the scale of something so atrocious as what we witnessed on 9/11. Um, on that day, it was just mind blowing, I think, to everyone.
And what went through your mind, of course, in the immediate hours after the attack was unfolding? Basically, within hours, the news media was reporting that it was, almost certainly Osama bin Laden. Interesting
Mhm.
now that, and we're going to get onto this later, they have attacks, beheadings in Nice, which are obviously motivated by the publication of cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. But even today, I notice in Sky News, they're still saying the motive remains unknown. But I'm going to save that for later because we're going to get into that. The other
Yeah, we
thing I
should
wanted
get
to
into
ask
that.
about,
It's
though,
important.
yeah, the other thing I wanted to ask about is we had this evacuation of bin Laden family members from the US in the weeks after 9/11. I'm looking at a
Mhm.
headline here from CBS
Mm.
News from way back on September 30th. Headline: Bin Laden family evacuated. Says 24 members of Osama bin Laden's family were urgently evacuated from the United States in the first days following the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, according to the Saudi ambassador to Washington. Now, of course, at the time, the question was, why is the US intelligence apparatus evacuating members of the bin Laden family when they could potentially have intelligence on the plot, on the
Mhm.
9/11 plot itself? Do you think, I mean, many people have tried to frame this in terms of a conspiracy, but do you think it was these members of the family simply pulling their strings and wanting to get the heck out of Dodge? Or do you think there was something more behind that? Because, of course, this formed the premise of Michael Moore's film. I think it was released in 2004, Fahrenheit 9/11. This was the
Mhm.
centerpiece of his documentary back then, asking why these bin Laden family members, with the aid of US authorities, were evacuated out of the US in the weeks following 9/11. Do you have any information on that? Or, as I said before, was it just them basically getting the heck out of Dodge?
So, just for your viewers, for them to know, so the four of us, my mom, my two sisters, and I, after 9/11, we received calls from no one, whether it was, from our own father and the family. Our father was walking around in Switzerland with private security and bodyguards, and we were the only bin Ladens with a listed phone number in Europe. So all the death threats and hate calls and journalists were ringing, at our home. And in the meantime, we had no protection because we don't have, the means to do so, like security guards and everything. And not a single person from the bin Laden family reached out, nor, on the other side. That being said, so that's the distinction I wanted to make. That being said, I know of exactly which headline you're speaking of because I saw it myself and everything. I know that the airspace was closed, and that all these members of the family were allowed to return to the Middle East, where obviously they have their whole infrastructure. I mean, certainly at the time, the bin Laden family was the most powerful family in Saudi Arabia after the royal family. So, when you have that level of power in a certain society, and this is all documented and you can find all of this online, but I know that there were financial ties between different financial vehicles in the US, Carlyle Group and things like that. It's well documented that there were, the investments of the bin Laden group were prolific, as well in the United States. So I don't know what were the ins and outs and how, it was sorted out. But the fact is that they were able to leave the US, in a hurry and be repatriated to Saudi Arabia.
I don't want to stick too long on the subject of 9/11, but I've got basically one more question on that, and then we're going to move on to your mother's history and talk about some other subjects here. Obviously, you're there as a child, young child, watching 9/11 unfold. You've got the horror of the event itself, the horror of the plane slamming into the Twin Towers, the horror of hearing the victim-told death numbers, the collapse of the towers and everything else. You've got that to deal with emotionally. And then within hours, you have the mainstream media reporting the culprit, Osama bin Laden, your uncle. So how emotionally did you deal with the twin horror of 9/11 itself and just the natural human revulsion to what was happening, to then hearing that your uncle, even though you are estranged from the family, you deliberately extricated yourself from the family, as we all know. What went through your head when you heard on the media that this was Osama bin Laden's doing, basically?
So before the name started circulating, first of all, I was completely devastated. Your viewers, won't necessarily know this, but by that time, the US was really like my second home after Switzerland. My mother had been taking me on a holiday 2 to 3 times a year since the age of 3. So at 14 years old, America was in my heart, my second home. And I was already, what I call myself, a patriot at heart. And so watching this unfold in the news was like watching someone attacking my home, my country, And so the sheer devastation of seeing this, and obviously the suffering and the loss of life on that day, that already I was just sobbing in front of the television, and my heart was there. My heart was there as I was watching. And then, my mother, the moment the second plane hit, she knew that, our name was going to be associated with this. And so I want to say an hour or so before the name first appeared on the screens, she sat, my 2 sisters and me, and she just told us, brace yourself, girls, your life is never going to be the same again. And so lo and behold, an hour later, this was all that was going on in the news. And it was obviously, as a 14-year-old girl who at that moment in time, was and already in my character, I'm quite private as a person. But one thing that has allowed me to sorry, I'm searching for my words in English, but one thing that has managed to make me, you know, sane or have a form of distance to the fact that I carry a name that is so opposed to who I am as a person, and to have a certain perspective is that, you know, I always think of, my first thought is always to those who greatly suffered and still suffer to this day from that loss. And so that puts, you know, things in perspective. Yes, I carry a name. Yes, you know, this is my life trajectory. I didn't choose it, but it's just the way it is. And, you know, every single person is dealt a hand of cards, you know, when they're born. This just so happens to be mine. And it's up to me. You know, I'm here. I'm so grateful to my mother for having, you know, extirpated me from growing up in a society like Saudi Arabia. I'm able to sit here, share my views and opinions, and state my beliefs. And clearly, my beliefs have nothing to do with the name that I carry, but I'm able to voice that, right? And so this is what I decide to do with my life, and this is how I decide to lead it. I don't want to hide from this name that I carry, and explaining myself is part of this package, but it's nothing in comparison to those that have to live every single day with the feelings of loss and suffering from this tragedy.
I'm just thinking on an immature level in terms of how kids behave in school, how vicious they are, how they pick on the weakness. And, you know, most people would say that this was character building. We have a lot of moral panic these days over bullying and harassment, especially on the internet. But, you know, that is a real thing in schools. And it does build character to a certain extent when you stand up to bullies. But I imagine, and I don't know if this is your experience, but you must have faced some kind of bullying or intimidation, or was it kept away from the other kids? Was it okay in school in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, or did you go through a kind of phase where you were bullied?
No, you know, I'd been in the same international school since the age of 3, 4. So I was really well known in the school, and my patriotism for America was really well known already by that point. You know, I had a huge flag of the US in my room that I'd gotten, you know, at the age of 12, 2 years prior, at International Day, even though I don't hold an American citizenship, you know, but I'd go. It's a day in the school where everybody dressed as their nationality, but I'd go dressed, you know, as an American, and I'd have the flag on my shoulders. So people in my school knew that I loved America so much. So they were very kind to me. I went to school the next day, and people were extremely like other students and everything. They were really kind to me, and showed concern, which was very, very nice of them. And then, yes, I did get teased. I've experienced, you know, many different things, you know, from carrying that name. But as you said, there's this, how would you say, climate at the moment that you can't say anything that is remotely, even if it's a joke, you know, people will take it badly. But thankfully, I'm not like that. I do enjoy some good humor. So.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? How we had a protest, for example, outside the French embassy in London yesterday.
I saw
and
that.
One of the signs being held by the Islamists was the right to insult is not the right to freedom of expression, something like that. The big tech conglomerates, the big tech monopolists have converged with the Islamists because you can't insult people as part of freedom of speech on social media platforms. And that's exactly what the Islamists want too. So they've literally apex together and come to the same agreement. I'm going to get into that in a second, though. We've got the book here, which is your mother's book, Inside the Kingdom, best-selling New York Times book, which she wrote, I believe it was it in the 80s, in the mid-90s?
She started writing it in the 90s, or even maybe in the 80s. She had jotted down notes, but she never thought she would publish it. She thought it would be, you know, she'd have 4 copies that she would have for each of us. And it was her way as a mother to explain, you know, the emotional price we paid from our father's rejection. And, you know, our family life was very complicated. And so
Yeah,
she
I want
wanted
to
to
get into that.
explain, but
Yeah,
she
just
wanted to
give us an
explain
overview
why.
of what she experienced in Saudi Arabia, and then there's several examples from within the book, specific examples that really piqued my interest. But her experiences in Saudi Arabia, of course, she married Osama's brother, your father, and what happened when she tried to leave the Bin Laden family. Can you give us an overview of that and what's in the book?
Yeah, so the book details really the first, half of the story, which is, falling in love with my father at a young age, and their romance, and then them getting married, and at some point moving to Saudi Arabia. And the book is fascinating, in all objectivity, because she describes a society that is usually extremely closed off, not to foreigners and to women, but because she was in this very privileged position and she was my father's right arm in all his affairs, she was privy to so many conversations, and he would confide in her about all the different layers within that very opaque society. And, the power plays between the princes and the different brothers within the Bin Laden clan, and how all of that works. And she was therefore able to analyze the society unlike any foreigner or woman has been able to in the past. And with that analysis and through the years came the realization that sadly, even though she witnessed a complete modernization materialistically of that society, throughout, the late 70s, after the boom, the
Yeah.
petrodollars and everything, she realized that sadly, in terms of culture and values, there wasn't a push for modernization happening. On the contrary. And that's when she decided, well, you know what, it was my choice to follow my husband here. And I cannot in good conscience impose this on my daughters. And it became then imperative for her to extract us from this situation in order to raise us in her home country of Switzerland, or, in the West generally, with Judeo-Christian values, with, our freedom, as opposed to a restrictive, Sharia law-based country like Saudi Arabia. So this is kind of like the whole story about the book. And then, yes, there is the second part, which she alludes to towards the end, which is the separation with our father, which, as you know, because we're friends, and we've discussed it, privately. But my parents split up. I was 8 months old. That part of my life is covered in the book, my very early years. But the separation, the divorce proceedings, and the ramifications of all of that, spanned 3 decades. And I'm 33. I turned 33 this year, and there are still, some lingering consequences to deal with that very acrimonious separation. And it's been privately, we've had to deal with a lot of stuff that hasn't necessarily been, a walk in the park.
Yeah. Now, specifically, a couple of stories in this book that I read it, I think it was over a year now, at least, maybe even more. Your mother, in terms of the modesty culture that she had to integrate within Saudi Arabia, she tells stories of how, from what I recall, she would want to visit her neighbor down the street, for example, 10, 20 meters down the street, and she would literally have to go out in full burqa, of course, but then they would have to have the driver drive her literally 10, 20 meters down the street to see her own neighbor. And even then, from what I recall reading in the book, it was by, like special dispensation. This was like a special treat that most women wouldn't normally have. There was another story of her visiting a market or a shop, and this all had to be carefully arranged in advance because this was, of course, just not allowed for many women in the 70s and the 80s in Saudi Arabia at that time. You of course, you probably remember those stories. Tell us about the modesty culture, your mother trying to visit her friends and neighbors, merely trying to go shopping, and how difficult that was in the modesty culture, which still, as I said before, hasn't really been modernized to any great extent and still exists today, and now is being imported into the West.
I see exactly which story you're referring to. And bear in mind that it's even crazier or stricter than what you just described, because it was within, the Bin Laden, kind of area or compound. And she was crossing the street to go see her sister-in-law, one of my aunts.
And they wouldn't even allow her to cross the street on her own, right?
No, and she, the first time that she did, she describes it in the book, and she talks about how it was such an act of, defiance to the system that she did that. And there are other, stories. I think my mom was one of the first women ever to go to the supermarket, and she describes the scenario in her book where all the men had to be taken out of the shop, and they were made to wait in a line outside the supermarket so that she could go in and choose what it was that she wanted to buy. And then,
because they weren't even allowed to look in her direction, right?
No. And the reason why she was able to do that was because she was part of the Bin Laden family, and so they could, pull that off and make it happen for her, because the story was that she was looking for a special type of milk or baby formula, and because the way that they would shop at the time is that they would ask what they needed, and then they would bring, all the different kinds or an assortment of what the woman was looking for, and then she would choose, and then they would bring the rest back to the shop. I mean, we're talking about, a life that is akin to something that we here in the West cannot comprehend.
So you came out vehemently in your letter to America with your support for President Trump. We've had 4 years of subversion, 4 years of the left trying to delegitimize President Trump's victory. 6 months at this point of non-stop rioting, which continues, as we saw in Philadelphia a few days ago. Again, the media afraid to cover it. Now, what are your thoughts on the election? Will Americans be intimidated into voting for Biden in exchange for what many voters appear to think will be, 4 years of peace? It's literally like the tactics of terror that they're trying to enlist them under. Or will all the polls be wrong once again, and will Trump sweep to a second term? What's your opinion on the election, which is basically now, 2-3 days away?
So I have complete faith in the American people. There are a few characteristics that, the Americans have, is their common sense and their boldness. And we've seen that, in 2016, when they came out to vote for President Trump the first time around. And, despite all the lies of the mainstream media, which I cannot stand, and I'd love for us to go more into detail on that later. But despite, all the lies, the fake news, the fake polls, all of, this narrative that they're trying to push, the support for the president, is just, I watched it online. It gives me so much energy and joy. I wish, because of stupid COVID, I cannot be on a plane to go join, the rallies. Otherwise, I'd be there, with all the other patriots. And it's just, you have these juxtapositions, photos on Twitter of, Biden with his ridiculous concentric circles, with his, handful of supporters. And then you have, the red waves of patriots, in full MAGA gear. And they want us to believe these polls, and they want us to believe, that, there's actually a close race going on between, a guy in his basement and, President Trump. It's just ridiculous. So from that point of view, I'm very confident. The only thing is that we know that, the left, with, all the different factions, the mainstream media, they have put in place, with the voter fraud, ballot harvesting, everything they're trying to do. Also, their scare tactics with these riots to try and intimidate people. They have, the support of, Hollywood and culture and everything, trying to push them in one direction. But the one thing that I think about is that, voters really have to make sure, Republicans and, Trump supporters really have to go vote, so that no matter what they try to pull on Tuesday, and in the following days, because, there's chatter that, with the help of the mainstream media, they're not going to declare, a winner, on the night of election. But the margin just needs to be unquestionable, so that no matter what they try to pull, we know that, we've won, because it is just so obvious to me that that will be the case, and, Trump will be the victor in this election, thankfully so.
Yeah. And with the polls, obviously, they always oversample Democrats 10 points or more. The polls are prescriptive rather than descriptive of the sentiment of the electorate. So, if the same thing mirrors what happened in 2016, I think they're going to be quite shocked by the outcome. We're going to take a pause now. We're going to come back, talk about the beheadings in France, the coronavirus lockdown with Noor Bin Ladin right here after this message.
You're watching Newsmakers with Paul Joseph Watson, brought to you by our sponsor, newsmakers.store.
Now, I really appreciate the great support that you've shown me in the past, and that needs to continue in the future. We're building a new crew. We're building an exciting new platform here, but it's only made possible by your fantastic support at Subscribe Star. Again, the link is in the description. Also, in this era of big tech censorship, they're trying to get in between us. They're trying to stop us from communicating. You can stop that by signing up for the newsletter at summit.news/newsletter. Again, link is in the description. And then for all the great new products, including Turbo Force, the potent energy drink, and Brain Force, the outstanding nootropic, they're all available at newsmakers.store. By supporting this broadcast, by allowing us to expand in an exciting new direction with insightful, impactful guests, we can really change the narrative, but only with your fantastic, enduring support by getting the products at newsmakers.store and by supporting me at Subscribe Store. All the links in the description. Now back to the interview.
You're watching Newsmakers with Paul Joseph Watson, brought to you by Summit.News.
And we are back with Noor Bin Ladin, noorbinladin.com. Again, all the links we talk about will be in the description below. Noor, of course, we've had a series of terror attacks in France over the past couple of weeks. We've had the beheading of a school teacher in Paris who showed cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad to pupils in his class about freedom of expression. We had another horrific beheading on Thursday. We've had 50 Turkish teenagers storm a Catholic church in Vienna yesterday shouting Allah Akbar. Now, of course, we were talking about Trump before the break. Trump has outperformed to an nth degree the Obama, Biden, Clinton administration by actually securing some semblance of peace in the Middle East by not bombing all these countries, by not invading them under false pretexts and creating terrorists that then we import into the West, as was the case with the Manchester Arena bomber, who our government, the United Kingdom government, literally rescued on a boat from Libya. 3 years later, he blows up children at a pop concert in Manchester. We had the Chechen jihadist who beheaded the school teacher Samuel Paty, another refugee given residency by the French government. We had the 3 terrorists who went on a knife rampage in Lyon back in April. Also, Sudanese refugees, starting to notice a pattern here. The majority of the Paris massacre terrorists exploited the refugee wave to enter Europe. And yet we still have this debate about, oh, of course we need to accept boat migrants, where in every case, and I'd list 4 there out of France alone, in virtually every case, it's either supposed immigrants, Islamic extremists who have been integrated, who have been given citizenship or even born in the country, or it's these boat refugees. And yet in the aftermath of these attacks, we hear the same thing over and over again, not just from the classical liberal left, but even from many people on the right, which is, oh, if we just continue to champion Enlightenment principles and free speech, this is how we stand up against this. No, I think we need to be making the centerpiece of the argument not about Enlightenment principles and free speech, important as though that is, but about border control and demographics. If we keep importing vast numbers of people, the majority of which don't have papers, we don't even know who they are, we're going to continue to see terror attacks on this scale time and time again. Yet that debate about demographics, about the fact that France's Muslim population is officially 8.8%, and that's on the last count. It's probably, I would venture, unofficially at least double that. But we're not having this debate. I mean, Douglas Murray wrote an excellent book, The Strange Death of Europe. But apart from that, in the more establishment centrist right circles, they're still droning on about Enlightenment principles. Do you agree with me? We need to make the debate more about demographics and strong border control. I don't see many terror attacks in Poland and Hungary, right? There's a reason for that.
Paul, I'm 100% on the same page as you. And, I've, even before we became friends, I was watching your content. My mom had actually sent me the first video of yours that I watched. And you've been talking about this subject for a very long time. And you're absolutely correct in everything that you say. We have the proof that the policies of countries like Hungary and Poland work. Eastern Europe has had a much more comprehensive and protective stance towards these terrorists, and they've managed to protect their citizens. We live here in Western Europe, and I tell you, I don't feel safe here. And sadly, it's just going to keep getting worse and worse. And as you say, they correctly don't want us to speak about demographics. They call us racists and, bigots or Islamophobes, their favorite insult, in order to avoid, dealing with this or looking at this topic. But the truth is that there is an increase of population that is inevitable. And I don't care if people are brown, red, blue, whatever color they are. It doesn't matter to me. When you look at, the look of the population, what matters to me is the ideology that comes along with a specific group of people. And the more this demographic, the more these people grow in number, the more there are people who are willing to kill in the name of this ideology. And we're seeing it, and sadly, we're living it. Every time there's a terror attack, my heart just, drops in my stomach. What happened, these past weeks, what happened to Samuel Paty 2 weeks ago, it's just unbelievable. And, coming back to what we were talking about in terms of, President Trump and his 4 years into office, this travel ban that he instituted straight into coming into office was one of, the best decisions he made, straight out of the gates. And, he got so much flack for it, but he knows what's at stake. He knows that the lives of American people are at stake. He has the best example, best as in worst, sadly, example when you look at Europe and Angela Merkel, what she did in 2015. Whenever I think about this, it makes me so angry. I cannot talk about it, but what she did was criminal. And all these people since then didn't have to die here in Europe. You talked about Manchester, Bataclan, people, it's you and me, when we're in London, we go to the pub, we go just hang out. Like, our whole way of life here in the West is under threat by this, what my mom used to call this army of shadow that she warned about. 20 years ago, she said that this was going to happen. Osama bin Laden was just a figurehead, and a leader of this jihadist movement. But, there are thousands and thousands and thousands who are willing to just lose their lives in the name of this ideology and take us down with them. And
the point I make over and over again, Noor, until I'm blue in the face, is that this isn't just a problem with Islamic extremists and that immediate, subsection of Islam. This is a problem with Islamism generally. And there are several examples of this. The one that I cite routinely is the fact that Salah Abdeslam, one of the Paris massacre culprits, he was able to evade capture after the November 2015 attacks by escaping to Molenbeek, Belgium, Brussels, which is one of these Islamic ghetto closed communities. Yes. He was able to evade detection from the authorities for 4 months after he's played a key role in slaughtering, what was it, over 200 people died, thousands injured during the Paris massacre attacks. He was able to hide out because of the local community helping him do that. They even tried to sneak him out in a wardrobe. So if that's happening, and it's happened on other occasions as well, the problem is bigger than Islamic extremism. It's in these Islamist communities that, although they may not commit violence themselves or may not even call for violence, when violence happens, they either ideologically protect, as we've seen with the mass protests against embassies, against Macron, against France, boycotts of French products, literally siding ideologically and morally with the jihadists, and then practically, in some cases, helping to hide the jihadists, which surely tells us that this little prescribed notion of Islamic extremism being just, oh, it's just a few extremists. It's not. It's not the entirety of Islam, and it's not the entirety of Islam. But the problem is bigger than what we're allowed to talk about, and until we're allowed to actually focus on the wider issue, this is never going to end, right?
But this is the media. The media and the politicians who say, there's one sentence that drives me and has driven me mad, all these years, is that sentence: Islam is a religion of peace. It's not true. And, there is a distinction to be made between Islam and then Muslims and how they apply Islam, right? But the press, they want to not talk about this. And in the meantime, we've had this infiltration of, actual cells and also an infrastructure and different groups, that have fronts that are, charitable organizations. But, the financial ties of all of this is in Europe is just, aiding and abetting these, lone terrorists as the media portrays them. They sell this narrative that it's just a few fringe, crazy people who are doing this in the name of Islam and that it has nothing to do with Islam. And it's just simply not true. The fact is that you have Islam is an ideology that comprises a set of religious beliefs, a military doctrine, and a political agenda. It's very reductive to say, first and foremost, that Islam is a religion because it's comprised of these three elements. And the thing is, the distinction that has to be made is that this is Islam, and then you have people who apply Islam in its literal classical form, how it's intended to be applied as per the documents, namely the Hadith, the Quran, the Sirah, and everything. And, the spectrum goes from those who apply it literally, including the jihadists who, commit, these atrocious crimes to the point of, killing themselves as well. And then you go to the whole other end of the spectrum of Muslims, which are, peaceful people who consider themselves cultural Muslims. Some of them who've never even opened the Quran. I've met Muslims who call themselves Muslims who've never even touched the Quran before. So that's the spectrum. But it's a lie to say that these attacks have nothing to do with Islam. And it just doesn't stand, this argument doesn't stand in and of itself, because these terrorists commit these crimes in the name of Islam. They say so themselves. So it's just another one of their gaslighting, practices of the media to say otherwise.
And projecting forward a couple of decades, obviously, it's probably going to be quite unlikely that we see closed borders and the kind of executive orders that Donald Trump introduced. Very unlikely that we're going to see deportations, even of actual radicals and extremists who appear to be able to escape that on a routine basis. But Michel Houellebecq, the famous French author, wrote a book in 2015 called Submission, which was published on the day of the Charlie Hebdo massacre. He predicted, I think his time scale was 10, 15 years into the future, that this is all going to end up with actual Islamist political parties rising to power, forming political alliances with leftists in government, and that's how they're going to use the threat, the intimidation of terror attacks, by coming in and saying, we're the Islamist party, we're the ones that can stop this, just give us power. and then you'll get coalition governments with leftist political parties that join forces with them. He predicted that, and he was very prescient with that prediction, also with the Yellow Vest uprising prediction in his subsequent book, Serotonin. Is that what you see over the next couple of decades? Islamists getting power in the West and exercising it, maybe having Sharia law zones in certain communities. Is that going to happen, or is there going to be a big backlash and we're actually going to see closed borders and some real solutions? Or do you kind of black-pilled on it, where you see eventually they're not just going to have cultural power and violence and intimidation, they're actually going to get into the seat of government in Western countries?
Paul, it's already happening. You have a parallel system of justice going on in several countries in Europe already, where you have Sharia courts, within Muslim communities, where you have women who are completely subjected, to a Sharia-based system of law within their own communities. If they want to get a divorce, their only method of recourse. Did you say recourse?
Yeah.
Their only method of recourse is to go to, their community. This is happening in the UK. If they want a divorce, they go to their local, Sharia court to get the divorce, because, the couple, upon arrival in the UK, or just because they have a blatant disregard of UK laws, they don't even register the marriage. And so the only way that they can get their divorce is to go to these courts, and they are at the mercy of, these Islamic, preachers and their set of rules and laws. I mean, this is happening now today already in Europe. And as we mentioned, the demographics, as the population increases, this is not going to go away. And there are, it's been proven in the history, if you look at, the 1400 years of Islam, it comes and goes in waves, right? Depending on their level of, might, whether, it's military or territorial, and demographics, as their population grows, they're able to impose more and more of their beliefs and their system of laws. And in any case, it's frightening, but this is their goal. Their goal is to live under Sharia law, because this is what they believe to be the best rule for any country. And, I've been in Ubers many times, countless times. I'm not just talking about one or two occurrences where, I get into conversations with the driver. This happened, in London. Anytime I'd visit London, I'd jump into an Uber, and more often than not, it would be a Muslim driver. And I cannot tell you the number of times where, after you get into a little bit of a conversation, even if the person had been living there for 27, 30 years in the UK, you would ask them and they would still say that they believe that Sharia law was the better system of rule. And that, that's what they were hoping for at some point in the future. They have a complete different mentality than our mentality, Paul. They're in it, for the long game. It's part of the ideology. And, whether they see it happen in their lifetime or for their future generations, it doesn't matter. They truly believe, that one day, that the mission, at least, is that one day the whole world be Muslim.
Which is, of course, not to say that there aren't problems with late capitalism in terms of degeneracy, in terms of it not offering young people anything of spiritual sustenance or meaning. But that's an entirely different debate. Maybe
but let me jump in here. Let me jump in here. There is a clear, you can observe, there was a complete erosion of our Western, ideals and values in our Christianity within Europe that's been happening over the last, 30, 40, 50 years, slowly but surely. And that has also participated in allowing, Islam to to come into our countries over here. It's all linked,
Yeah.
at the end of the day.
The vacuum had to be created for
The
that to fill it,
vacuum,
right?
exactly. That's the word
Yeah.
that I was looking for, the vacuum. Yeah.
We're going to talk about COVID now. We've been going for a good 45 plus minutes, but I want to talk about COVID and be very careful when I'm talking about it to abide by YouTube guidelines so they don't just delete this video and we've wasted all our time here. But you got coronavirus and you recovered pretty quickly, which I'm shocked about, because it's not as if there isn't a 99.98% recovery rate for people under the age of 50 to recover from it. You got coronavirus quite recently. Tell us about it.
I'm with COVID now, actually, as we're talking.
You're struggling on with COVID, and yet you're still able to speak and breathe. It's amazing.
Yeah, just my voice, my nose is slightly more nasal than usual, a tad. But yes, I got my diagnostic on Tuesday, and I'm in quarantine until Wednesday. I cannot leave my house because I'm with the China virus. Listen, I've had flus that have been worse than this. That's all I'll say.
Which is
not
not
even
to
taking
say
medication.
that elderly people with debilitating illnesses aren't suffering through this, but that's the point.
Of course.
We need to separate society and let society continue. Now, as we speak, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is about to give a speech, and we're expecting him to announce another new national lockdown until December 1st in the United Kingdom. Of course, it's happened in Germany, France. People are fleeing Paris. In a situation, by the way, where bed occupancy in London and in many other areas of the UK is below average for this time of year. Deaths across the UK from all causes are below average compared to what they were last year. The first lockdown, we were told, we need to just do it for a few weeks, maybe a month to protect the NHS. They built all the extra hospitals. None of them were ever used. They shut them all down. The hospitals were empty. The nurses were doing TikTok dances. Thousands of untreated cancer patients are going to die. Many other illnesses that are not getting treated because people are either afraid to go into hospital or their appointments are getting cancelled. We have mass unemployment, which causes poverty, which causes starvation. We have 86% increase in antidepressant prescriptions, suicides doubling. We have the German health minister coming out and saying the lockdowns will kill more people than coronavirus. And yet our governments continue to follow this insane policy over and over again. Again, follow the guidelines of your local health authority. I have to say that, otherwise this video gets deleted. But China's economy is back, recovered to what it was pre-COVID. That was the epicenter. That's where it came from. And yet we have this continuing insanity of lockdown policies. The first lockdown was supposed to solve the problem. Didn't work. Now we're having another one. We're having regional lockdowns. There's going to be more lockdowns after that. I'm starting to think, Noor, that there might be another agenda at work. I'm just saying, because everyone seems to have ignored Sweden, which didn't lock down, which didn't force its population to wear masks, and that has the lowest death rate in Europe. They've recovered economically better than any other European country, and they're basically back to normal, whereas we in the United Kingdom, in France, Germany, other areas are facing months and months more of debilitating, crippling lockdown. Do you think it's possibly, without delving into dangerous conspiracy theories, which we can't do, maybe something more at play in the government reacting to this virus with yet another lockdown?
I think most of what I want to say will probably get me banned or get this video banned from YouTube.
That's what I was talking about. I didn't want to do like a 50-minute interview about Islam and 9/11 and then just to have it deleted because we said a few wrong words about COVID. But yeah, go ahead.
So what shall I say that won't get us that won't get this video banned?
Well, you can talk about you can, as far as I know, they allow us to criticize the lockdown policy. I think that's as far, but you can't say certain things about the origins of this virus.
In my piece that I wrote for The Spectator, which was the diary, and so it was kind of tongue in cheek, the tone, which is, the same piece where I said that I got more, flack for supporting President Trump than for carrying my name, that same piece. I talked about the story that I was supposed to be in London in September, late September, for my goddaughter's christening. And I couldn't come because of quarantine in the UK. And, obviously I had a pang in my heart that I couldn't be there, for my own goddaughter's christening. But I just got so sad thinking about all the people who couldn't say goodbye to their loved ones who passed away during the lockdown. And, all these elderly people who were deprived of human contact when this is actually what sustains them, to keep going on in their life. And to those who passed away in probably just heartbreaking conditions. And you mentioned it, when you were just speaking, all those people who didn't have access to care, for their cancer treatments, or who weren't diagnosed with illnesses, for months. And if they had been diagnosed earlier, who knows, they could have received treatment and, be saved. I'm thinking about cancer again. When you look at all of, the ramifications from these very arbitrary measures at the end of the day, and President Trump said it, from the beginning, the cure cannot be worse than the disease. And sadly, it has been. This year has been absolutely atrocious for all the business owners. Obviously we talked about just now the human, consequences of, people who couldn't get care and all of that, but also just, people who invested, their whole lives into businesses and who have lost everything. And who is going to help these people now? They're, but it's part of a bigger scheme, where we basically all become very much dependent and we lose our autonomy. And I won't go further into that, but there is a clear,
they call it the Great Reset, from what I've heard.
Reset.
But now, of course, we have police chiefs in the UK over the past few days saying that they have the power basically to enter people's homes and break up Christmas family gatherings. Good luck.
Yeah.
You need a warrant. But also predicting potential riots and civil disobedience because, of course, they've done polls which show that only 18% of people are complying with these lockdown measures, with self-isolation. So then they're going to have to get more draconian. Then that's probably going to create a bigger backlash. But that all remains to be seen. I'm going to wrap it up for now, Noor, but tell people, what are your future plans? I think you talked about in the past writing a book, and then tell people about your website where they can find more information.
Absolutely. Paul, it's been a real pleasure being on the show with you. I mean, apart from the camera aspect of it, it's really like talking to a dear old friend, which I always love when we catch up together. Listen, my plans, I just really wanted to state my views ahead of the election. There is more on my website, especially my letter to America, which is on there. At noorbinladin.com. Just for your viewers who might not know the reason why I spell it the way I do, BINLADIN, it's because that's the original translation of the name. That's how my grandfather used to write it. And it's just a question of different media outlets and members of the family who write it with the E at the end. It's a question of translation. But so it's Noor Bin Ladin, double with the 2 I's.com. And future plans, it's, I'm writing my book. I've been working on it for many months now. I'm not sure when it will be ready, maybe next year, but it's about many of the topics, that we discussed on this talk, but which were more micro, and taking it at a macro level in terms of how we got to the point where we got to the first quarter of the 21st century, how we were, slowly but surely brought towards this great reset, and where we're going for the rest of the 21st century, and where do we want to be. And I think that the answer to that question is that we want to remain, free human beings, and not, part of a system that enslaves us in this global, government order that they're trying to establish, and the last, rampart that will, will be a chance for us to retain that freedom is, if President Trump gets reelected for a second term, and he's our champion, and he's going to defend the Constitution of the United States, which is our last, rampart before this world that they're trying to usher in for us.
Okay, NoorBinLadin.com. Again, all the links will be in the description. Noor, it's been an absolute pleasure. Really appreciate you joining us today, and we'll speak to you very soon. Thank you very much.
Pleasure was mine, Paul. Thank you.
You're watching Newsmakers with Paul Joseph Watson, brought to you by Summit.News.
This broadcast is brought to you by my Subscribe Star subscribers. Please, if you value this broadcast, and we're expanding, we're hiring new people, we're going to do way more of these impactful, insightful interviews, go to the Subscribe Star link and support me today in the description. Also go to newsmakers.store. That's where we have all the great products, including Turbo Force, the most potent cognitive enhancing energy drink that I've ever had. I want you to try it out as well. All the other great products available at newsmakers.store. Again, all these links in the description. We also have limited edition, brand new merchandise. The new swag is now available at Teespring. Again, the Teespring link is in the description. And sign up for the Summit.News newsletter so we can stay in contact in this era of big tech censorship and purging, so they will never get in between us. Those are the links. They're all in the description. Going to do way more of these exciting interviews in the future. That's going to wrap it up for now. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
You're watching Newsmakers with Paul Joseph Watson, brought to you by our sponsor, Newsmakers.store.